Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next talk in our Homelands history series. We're super excited to be coming to you today and to bring you some more information. And today it is on Kampoosa Bog. I will be in the background monitoring your questions. If you have any questions, please make sure you put them in the comments below and we will answer them as they come in at the end of the presentation. Anything you can ask about Kampoosa Bog or about Stockbridge Muncie or whatever. And I am now going to turn over this presentation to our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Nathan Allison. Again, any questions, please put in the comment and take it away, Nathan.
Thanks, Heather. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nathan Allison. I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Stockbridge Muncie community. And thanks for joining us today, where through the power of technology, we are tuning in from far and wide. So I'm happy to welcome you all to the second of our Homelands History series. This is an ongoing series that invites scholars and professionals to speak on topics related to the tribe's interests in cultural heritage and its ancestral homelands throughout the Hudson River Valley. So today's presentation focuses on a significant archaeological site in Berkshire County, Massachusetts, more specifically Stockbridge. The town of Stockbridge has and continues to play a massive role in the tribe's history. Often highlighted has been its colonial experience with the English during the 18th century. However, little is known archaeologically about this area prior to Euro-American contact. So until our recent 2019 Oxrose Feast Archaeological Project, which identified an ancient archaeological site within the town's limits, Kampoosa Bog had been the only previously recorded archaeological pre-contact site investigated in the town of Stockbridge. So I guess I want to note that today's talk is an outgrowth of repatriation efforts by the office. Per the guidance of our Historic Preservation Committee, our office has been undertaking work to have the Kampoosa Bog collection returned to the tribe. So before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, just to recap on Heather's comments, remember that our discussion will be followed by a brief Q&A session, and we really invite you to leave comments and questions in the chat section below, and I'll read those for our presenter to answer following the presentation. So I'm pleased to introduce this afternoon's speaker. Our guest has served as lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at University of Massachusetts Amherst. His research interests focus on Eastern North American archaeology, Native American history and culture, and cultural resource management. He has regularly directed archaeological field schools through the university at the Emily Dickinson Museum in Homestead. And he was the previous director of the UMass Archaeological Services, which acted in a cultural resource management capacity and subsequently carried out the archaeological excavations related to this afternoon's presentation on the Kampoosa Bog. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Johnson for his talk titled, The Garden in the Woods, Forest Management at Kampoosa Bog, Massachusetts, 4000 BP. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Heather. And I'd also like to thank the Stockbridge Muncie community for inviting me to talk about the archaeological sites around Kampoosa Bog in Stockbridge. And this is a chance for me to talk about one of my favorite sites, or two of my favorite sites, one of my favorite projects. And it was a favorite project and still is, because for one thing, it's a beautiful location. There's also lots of interesting artifacts, which I will show you. And even more, the story the archaeological sites told, what we learned about forest management in ancient times, forest management by ancestors of the members of the community. And most of all, that the artifacts in the field and laboratory documents are soon to be transferred to the Stockbridge Muncie community to whom they appropriately belong. And I want to begin by sort of stepping back and talking a bit about hunter-gatherers and farmers. In the past 50 years, let me start by sharing my screen here. You can see this instead of me. There we go. Does that look good? Okay. In the past 50 years, archaeology and anthropology have seen many important changes. We've collected so much information on things like past environments, ancient peoples and their ways of life. And we've begun to see people's relationships with their environments in a different way. We recognize that people's interactions with their surroundings are complex, they're creative and endlessly variable. And this is true for all kinds of people, including people that we refer to as hunter-gatherers, people who live off wild plants and wild animals. And it was once commonly thought, and I suppose it still is today, that hunter-gatherers live at the mercy of their natural environment. They react to environmental changes, but they don't purposefully change or modify their environments. In contrast, farmers interact with their environments very, very differently. Because farming is essentially, and this is a definition that was first written, as far as I know, by an anthropologist named Roy Rappaport. Farming is the creation and maintenance through human labor, materials, and knowledge or information of an artificial ecosystem. Why does this keep advancing the slide? And farmers, so, think an artificial ecosystem that yields high densities of food, plants, or animals. And, think about that. That's what a farm is. That's what a ranch is. It's an artificial ecosystem. Hunter-gatherers don't do that, but farmers create those and live off of them. But now we know it's not quite that simple, because hunter-gatherers do and did in the past purposefully alter their environments. They work on them so that they yield more wild plants and more wild animals. And in the forested environment of New England, this took the form of forest management using fire, using burning. In the 17th century, European colonists and travelers, they described indigenous forest management practices in eastern Massachusetts. Here's a quote from William Wood. He was an English colonist. He lived in the area north of Boston, and he wrote a book called New England's Prospect. And he wrote a lot about the indigenous people of that area. And he wrote about how they burned the undergrowth in the fall. Not the big trees, just the understory. It being the custom of the Indians to burn the wood in November when the grass is withered and leaves dried, it consumes all the underwood and rubbish which would otherwise spoil their much affected hunting. Now, another Englishman, Thomas Morton, who lived south of Boston, also described this practice. They are accustomed to set fire of the country in all places where they come and to burn it twice a year, viz. At the spring and the fall of the leaf. And this is forest management using, hang on a second, I seem to have a timer going here. I'll just bear with me. If I could just take a moment, I will fix that. Sorry about that. All right, let me just do a quick fix. Sorry. Okay, that should do it. Here we are. Okay. So this is forest management. This is using fire to maintain a productive forest. And by creating areas of new undergrowth, it makes the forest more diverse, and it makes for higher numbers of deer, bears, turkeys, other animals that thrive on that new growth that sprouts up after the burning. And Europeans also described how the deer and other animals that were attracted to this new growth were sometimes literally harvested in large-scale communal game drives, like this one, which was depicted by Champlain. And in this picture, you can see people on the left, driving a variety of types of animals into this fence, which funnels them toward the hunters who are ready to dispatch them. In the foreground, it's showing some other methods of hunting with a tree spring trap. And if you look closely, you can see that the people who are driving the deer are actually beating bones together. It looks like a limb bone and a scapula or shoulder blade that they're using to create a racket to frighten the deer to get them to run into the fence. So in the 1600s, the indigenous people of New England and the Northeast were practicing forest management. And remember, these people are farmers. They're not hunter-gatherers. Although they did hunt and fish and gather, they planted gardens. They grew maize, beans, squash, tobacco, and other crops. And here's a drawing also attributed to Champlain. It shows a Wampanoag settlement in 1605 with gardens planted around the houses and a very open forest. Now, until recently, the earliest evidence we have of this kind of forest management was from these 17th century accounts. What we learned from the research we did at Kampoosa was that this practice actually goes back thousands of years before those observations. Thousands of years even before people in this area began farming maize. So in Massachusetts, archaeological finds of maize go back about 1,000 years. And the evidence from the Kampoosa Bog project suggests that the forest management goes back as far as 4,000 years ago. So let's get to that. Here's Kampoosa Bog. It's a very unusual environment. It's a protected area and it's located in Stockbridge. And here's an aerial photo of the area. Kampoosa Bog is located, boy, to the best of my remembrance, it was 1993. It's on the left, upper left of this photo. And the two archaeological sites we investigated were located on either side of what archaeologists call an area of disturbance, but which most people call the Massachusetts Turnpike. And I've marked the westbound lane there so you can orient yourself from your view up in the air. And another recent disturbance to the area is a Tenneco gas pipeline. And I've pointed to that with the other arrow in this slide. And you can see this little thin line that goes through the woods. It's an open clearing. And that pipeline is the reason these sites were investigated. Here's a closer view of the corridor. It's this narrow strip of cleared land. And they were going to put in another line, so they were going to expand the corridor. And the two archaeological sites were located along the margins of the pipeline. And they would be destroyed by the construction of the new pipeline. And it was not feasible to avoid these two sites because it would have meant routing the pipeline through Kampoosa Bog. So before they were destroyed, the sites were excavated by a team of archaeologists from UMass Archaeological Services. And I was not the director of archaeological services then. In 1993, I was the field director for the project, or project manager. And so we did this excavation under a contract with Tenneco in the summer of 1993. That's nearly 30 years ago. But we're going to be talking about even earlier stuff. So we excavated at two archaeological sites, and one of them was a habitation area, and the other one, it was a work area. And then we also studied sediment cores that were taken from Kampoosa Bog. So I'll talk about the sites first. The habitation site was located next to a small stream that flows into the bog. And then the work area was situated very near the margin of Kampoosa Bog. And this slide summarizes the difference between the two sites. The habitation site contained cooking hearth features and many small trash deposits. lots of stone tools, flakes or chipping waste, chipping waste, the byproduct of making stone tools, and ceramics. It was a multi-component site, as many Massachusetts sites are, meaning it was occupied during at least 2 different time periods. And judging from the artifacts, it was used most intensively between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, and then again between 2,000 and 1,000 years ago. These are very rough dates just to make them easier for me to remember. But perhaps as recently as the 17th century. And I say that because even though we didn't find, the typical European trade goods, it's true that not everybody was interested in those trade goods. And recently, a number of sites that were thought to have been much earlier because they didn't have trade goods in them turned out to be much later, and the people had just rejected European trade goods. One reason might have been that they thought they were associated with epidemic disease, which in fact was true. It wasn't the goods themselves, it was the people who they were trading with. The work area contained no direct evidence of habitation. There were no cooking hearths, and there were no trash deposits, and there were no ceramics either, but there was a huge quantity of stone flakes and a large number and wide variety of stone tools. And those finds suggested that this is an area where people were working. They were making tools and using them. And the work area is early. It dates from 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, roughly. So I'll show you some pictures of the excavation as it was going on. We excavated in the late spring and early summer, and we excavated different sized units. Some larger squares measured 2 meters on a side, about 6 feet. That's what you're seeing here. There's 2 of our crew, Susan Houghton-Emy in the foreground, John Murray in the back, taking notes. Susan is now a research scientist in demography at the University of Michigan. Now, since both sites were forested, we had to place our units between the trees. It's very difficult and hazardous to dig when there's a tree right in the middle of the unit. This is Tim Barker, who was our crew chief, and Tim worked as the UMass Archaeological Services crew chief for decades. Here he is as a much younger man, as we all the men were. He's using a theodolite precision measuring instrument similar to a transit to create a metric grid across the site so that each square or rectangle and the artifacts within it could be precisely and accurately located on a map of the site. And we often excavated in the rain. It rained a lot that spring. Here are 2 of our crew, Stacy King and Tess Doyle. They're excavating under a tarp. That's what you see at the top of that picture. And we excavated every unit down to bedrock. And that was easy to do because bedrock was almost always not very far below the surface. Stacy's feet in this picture are resting on bedrock. This is George Claxton, one of our field crew, and George always wore military clothing in the field. George later went on to become the crime reporter at the Greenfield Recorder newspaper for many years, and he now works for Homeland Security and travels all over the country assisting people in the aftermath of various disasters like floods and tornadoes. Here's George and Maureen Manning. They're reviewing their field notes. Maureen is a very talented artist as well as an excellent archaeologist, and she was for many years the staff artist for UMass Archaeological Services. And she drew really excellent pictures of many of the artifacts that we found. Here's a unit that's been excavated to bedrock, and you can see how shallow this site is. You can also see how difficult it is to take good archaeological photographs in the woods. You get all these shadows and light areas. Now, both sites had very thin soil deposits with bedrock right under the surface in some places, or even sticking out above the surface. This is Liz West standing in one of the trenches we dug. At the habitation site, we dug the trenches to give us a continuous profile of the soil across the site. And here's an overhead view of the trench through the habitation site. You see it skips around a bit because it has to avoid the trees. And then some of the trench is actually part of larger excavation units. Now, I took this photo up in a tree, and I made a ladder by finding two trees that were growing right next to each other, and I attached cross pieces of wood using duct tape, one of the greatest technological innovations in the history of humanity, in my opinion. So after I made the ladder, I asked for a volunteer to climb up the ladder and take photos of the site, and then I did it myself. Here's a closer view of the trench through the habitation site, and you can see how shallow the soil is. Now, when you have a forest growing in about 2 feet of soil for thousands of years, the tree roots will get very dense and they will push artifacts around. And then the trees fall, they pull up all their roots with soil and artifacts attached to it, and then the roots eventually decay. All of the soil and artifacts come back down, but they're all mixed up. So many, if not most, if not all of the artifacts that we found were not found exactly where they had been deposited. And this disturbance by living organisms, trees in this case, as opposed to disturbance by plowing or by erosion, archaeologists call this bioturbation. And both sites had a lot of problems with bioturbation. We were actually digging through a root mat. And here is one of our crew, Bob Payne, who is now, I believe, a professor in forensic anthropology at Texas Tech University. He found a very large root growing right through his excavation unit at the work area. And you can't just chop these things out with an axe because the shaking would cause the sidewalls of the unit to fall down. So he was very pleased, as you can see, when he got this root out. It is almost exactly 2 meters long, the size of his excavation unit. And all of this root disturbance, it limits the kinds of interpretations we can make. The cooking hearths, the trash deposits that we found in the habitation area, they often had no really clear structure. So what may have started out as a stone-lined pit filled with ash and charcoal and some artifacts, by the time we excavated, it had been reduced to an amorphous smear. We could tell it was there, but we couldn't see its structure. And that limited our ability to make associations between artifacts and between artifacts and charcoal samples that we might have been able to radiocarbon date, carbon-14 date. So it was very difficult to use carbon-14 dating here because you couldn't be sure whether artifacts right next to each other or right next to a charcoal sample were actually from the same time. They've been mixed together by thousands of years of tree root growth. So speaking of artifacts, let's look at some of them. We had ceramic sherds from dozens of pots, and all the ceramics were found at the habitation site. And I'd like to digress for a moment. Why archaeologists love ceramics? Because they don't decay, but they break and get thrown away. And furthermore, so there are lots of them. Every step in the manufacturing process in pottery, it leaves its mark on the piece. From where they get the clay to what is then added to the clay, temper is added to the clay to make a paste, and then how the vessel is shaped, how it's decorated or treated, on the surface, and then the firing of the pot. You can learn about all of those steps in the process by carefully examining the sherds. So most of the pottery we found here probably dates based on the way it's the surface is treated and the kind of paste and the manufacturing techniques. It's from the more recent of those two occupations, somewhere between 2000 and 1000 years ago. And you can see how these were decorated by impressing onto the surface things like fabrics or maybe pieces of wood wrapped with cord. The two sherds at the top actually fit together, and combined they make, as far as I'm aware, the largest ancient vessel fragment in Berkshire County. Now moving on to stone tools. Stone tools also break and they don't decay, but unlike ceramics, with stone tools, every step in making a stone tool or resharpening it or reshaping it, it obliterates the earlier stages. So the things you can learn from stone tools are very different from what you can learn about the manufacturing process in ceramics. Now, these artifacts all look different, but the base parts are very similar. And they are variations on a variety of tool that is called the snook-kill point in Western Massachusetts and the Atlantic point. And here, get my air quotes in the screen. Because I think that none of these are actually points, at least when they were finally lost or thrown away. The three on the left, I believe, are knives. And I say that because the blades are asymmetrical. One side is straight and the opposite side is curved. And then the next one to the right is a piercing tool with a very narrow blade. And then on the far right, a scraper with a rounded blade. So the dates of the ceramics and the dates of the snook-kill artifacts indicate the sites were used during the two time periods I've already mentioned. Times that, spoiler alert, coincide with periods of forest understory burning, which I will get to very soon. The sites also had stories to tell about what the people were doing there. The work area in particular was unusual. Most of the sites we excavate are habitation sites because that's where people leave behind the most trash. I mean, archaeological data. At the work area, we found this cache of 9 stone blades. We call these bifaces, and they're all made from Hudson Valley chert. And they all have fairly similar bases. You can see that they're all kind of the same kind of artifact, but otherwise they have differences. Many of them don't seem to be quite finished. The one in particular looks very unfinished. The least finished of all. A few look ready to use or like they've already been used. And like the second from left on the bottom, it looks like it's already been used as a knife. But all of them are also ready to be shaped into final form or a completely new form, depending on what's needed at the time. You need a scraper, take one of these and round off the end. A knife, well, one of them's already a knife. A piercing tool, you would narrow that blade right down, or a spear point, make it nice and symmetrical and sharply pointed. And this is a technological strategy that emphasizes adaptability and flexibility and also portability. And people, especially hunter-gatherers, who usually move pretty frequently and have to carry their possessions from place to place. And if they rely on lithic technology, that is making and using stone tools, they almost always do this. They make multi-purpose tools or tools that can be adapted quickly, reshaped, repurposed, rather than carrying around a set of specialized tools. Now, these were all found pretty close together, as if someone made them, bundled them up, and then tucked them away for future use, like you put away gardening tools for the winter. That's another way to keep things portable. Leave caches of tools in places where you intend to return. Here are some scrapers. These all have those big square snook kill stems at the bottom. But if you look at the top, the rounded edges, and these could have been made from any of those stone blades in the cache. These rounded edges are actually, you can see it particularly on the one on the right, actually polished and smooth, probably from scraping hides. Here are some more piercing tools, and you can see the one on the left, it has that snook kill type base. So they're using a sort of a preform with the base already made so that it could be fit into a handle. And then the blade is for whatever is needed at the time. So among the use of a piercing tool would be piercing hides so they could be stretched on a frame for scraping. And then here's something that's different. This is not made of chert. All the other ones I've shown you were made of chert. This is made of quartzite. It's very large. And in the middle of this tool, it's very smooth along the edge, top and bottom. And I think that's probably from being hafted, attached to a handle, and it might have been smoothed on purpose to make it so it didn't cut into the sinew or rawhide that was being used to attach it to the handle, or maybe it just sort of rocked and moved a little bit inside the handle, and that made it smooth. It's just one of my favorite artifacts of all. And I've never seen another one like it. It's a heavy duty tool. It's possibly used in butchering. And it looks like a multi-purpose tool, right? It's got a pointed end and it's got a blunt end. So here at the work area, people worked with a cache of blades, preforms, we might think of them. They could be modified to more specialized forms as needed. And they also used multi-purpose tools like this one. Multi-purpose tools are another common technological strategy among hunter-gatherers who have to carry their tools from place to place. It's better to have one multi-purpose tool than two or more specialized tools. Now I wanted to show this one. Unfortunately, the photo cuts off the very tip of it, but this is just a beautiful piece of flaked stone artistry. And it's of exceptional skill. And realize, I like to point out when showing people something like this, every person watching this, no matter what your background, has at least some ancestors who could do this kind of work. And the little ridges that mark where flakes have been removed on this tool, they are smooth. And that suggests that this was kept and carried around, perhaps in a pouch, for a long time, or a sheath. And it wasn't broken. There's a little break at the very lower left corner of it. So how did it end up in the ground? Something like that had obviously been carried around. And this is a tool. This is not a tool you use once and throw away. So how did it get lost? Well, I mean, you can make up your own story about that. As an older brother, my guess would be that someone's younger brother borrowed it and then lost it. But, just one thing that archaeology, it invites us to contemplate the past and make up stories and just think about them. How did this get there? How did that get there? It's like food for our imaginations. Finally, in the artifacts from the work area, we found indirect evidence of the understory burning that I talked about. And the evidence wasn't in the tools, but it was in the stone flakes, the waste products from making stone tools. Many of the flakes from the work area had what we call pot lid scars on their ventral surfaces. And the pot lids are these little divots. They pop off the surface of a piece of chert when it's heated, and There are these little sort of roundish bits that have just sort of popped right off. You can't see that they've been struck anywhere necessarily to get these flakes to come off. They just came off, and some of them are just right in the middle of a flake. The one second from the right and at the bottom, for example. Now, most of the time when you find something like this, it's because a flake fell into a cooking fire. But at the work area, there were no cooking fires. So another possibility, maybe these chert pieces were being heat treated before they were made into a tool, and that's why we find the pot lid scars on them. And sometimes people did heat treat materials before starting to flake them. But if that were the case, we'd only find pot lid scars on the dorsal surfaces of the flake. So what do I mean by dorsal surface of the flake, ventral surface of the flake? I will try to explain. This illustrates what I mean. So when a flake is struck from a larger piece, from the side in this picture, the dorsal surface is the side of the flake that was already on the exterior of the larger piece. And the ventral surface is the side that's newly exposed when the flake is struck. And the dorsal surface is covered with flake scars, the negative impressions of flakes that were already struck off before this particular flake was struck off. And the ventral surface is usually just one smooth surface. So you go back here, if you look at the lower left, that is a classic ventral surface. Also that one I had pointed out earlier, second from the right on the bottom row. It's kind of hard to tell dorsal or ventral surface when they have all these pot lid scars on them. I think the one at the upper right is possibly a dorsal surface flake. So it's at least plausible that these flakes were subjected to fire sometime after they were struck, when an understory fire went through the area. So it's not definitive evidence, but it's another suggestive evidence. So this idea of forest management by understory burning, we've looked at the timing between 5,000 and 3,000, I've been saying 4,000 and 3,000, and 2,000 and 1,000 years ago, well before the earliest evidence of farming, and also this possible evidence of fire from the flakes. Now let's look at the evidence from the sediment cores to wrap this all together. Now, although we excavated in the spring and summer, the sediment cores were taken in the winter because it's only safe to walk out on the bog during the winter. In warm weather, Kampoosa bog has many floating vegetation mats that seem solid until you try to walk on them. So here are the people extracting the sediment cores. They were extracted by Charlie Lang and Bill Patterson of the UMass Forestry Department, and someone else too. There's a third person in that first on the left side that I don't know who they are, but Charlie and the red and Bill Patterson, professor of forestry in the dark green coat on the right. And they're pushing this metal tube down into the muck at the bottom of the bog. And then they pull it up. And here's what the core looks like, a cylinder of black glop. And those cores were painstakingly analyzed by Charlie Lang. They contained pollen, tiny shells, bits of charcoal, and these things that settle into the muck at the bottom of the bog, year after year, layer after layer. And as you travel down the core into the deeper layers of muck, you're traveling back in time. And as the forest changes over time, different kinds of pollen from different kinds of trees fall into the bog and settle to the bottom. So the pollen in the core is evidence of changes in the forest over time. It creates an environmental record. And some of these cores, they did a number of cores. Some of them went back 12,000 years. Now, what Charlie does is he took little slices, a series of slices along the core, He radiocarbon dated some of them because this is full of organic material. So it's good for carbon dating. And then using a microscope, he identified, counted all the pollen grains in these slices. And good for him. That would drive me crazy and probably blind too if I had to do that work. So I really respect Charlie for having that kind of persistence. So the final product of this research that he did was an environmental history. And that environmental history of the region right around the bog is expressed in what we call pollen diagrams. And those look like this. So Charlie hands me one of these and I say, what? Can you explain this to me? So here's the explanation. This is one of the pollen diagrams from Kampoosa Bog. And it was taken from a very small inlet in the bog right up against the work area site. So it represents local conditions. Out in the middle of the bog, it's more likely that pollen's coming in from all over a much wider area. So some things to note: radiocarbon dates are along the left side. And the earliest one on this core is 4,760 years ago, roughly. And then the one on top is 250 years ago. And those dates are taken from the organic material inside the core. Each column here represents a type of plant, represented by pollen or spores. And they reflect the changes in the thickness in the black or gray column reflects changes in the percentage of all pollen that's represented by the pollen from that species. So it reflects changes in the composition of the forest. And the pollen diagram shows 4 pieces of evidence that suggest forest management through understory burning that coincide with the periods during which the sites were occupied. And those periods are shown on the right. And you can look at the diagram and you can see at least 2 columns that really match up with when the sites were occupied. And what are those columns? Well, first, the sediments contained many microscopic pieces of charcoal. Now, often when people do pollen cores, they don't bother with the charcoal. But Charlie actually counted semi-microscopic pieces of charcoal, and he measured their abundance as a ratio of charcoal pieces to pollen pieces. So you can see that at 2 times there were these big spikes in charcoal, an earlier period of 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, and a later period of about 2,000 to 1,000 years ago. And those were the 2 periods that the sites were occupied. And then second, and I found this really interesting, here we go, monolete fern spores. That is the left of the 2 columns that are outlined in red. So monolete ferns colonize burned over areas. And they sprout from rhizomes, these little tubers in the soil. And the rhizomes are destroyed in large cataclysmic forest fires, but they survive low intensity understory fires. I see I'm getting, going over time a little bit. I'm almost finished. Third is that you don't get peaks in grasses. And you would get peaks in grasses if we were looking at cataclysmic forest fires. But we don't. So the ferns grow, but not grass. That suggests the canopy, the forest canopy, is still in place. It's understory burning that we're looking at here. And fourth, and this is not as tight a piece of evidence, but chestnut rises in frequency among the pollen during those same periods. Now, chestnut is promoted by repeated understory fires. It's notably fire resistant. So with repeated understory fires that don't necessarily kill the big trees, but they do stress them, chestnut will have an advantage, and it may gradually outcompete other species. Now that's going to happen over a longer period than ferns sprouting up right after the fire. So the rise is delayed and it's gradual. But of course, chestnuts are also one of those desirable plants. It's food, they're food for deer and other animals and for people too. So this is the earliest evidence of forest management in the Northeast. It's the earliest by more than 25 centuries. And it suggests that the indigenous people of the Northeast, and specifically the ancestors of the Stockbridge-Munsee community, have been managing their forest environment long before they adopted maize farming. Remember, that was less than 1,000 years ago. Here we go. The third most common cause of forest fires. We didn't find any evidence of that at the archaeological sites. So let's circle back to our definition of farming. You know, it's more than just wearing overalls and driving around in tractors. It's the creation and maintenance of an artificial ecosystem through human labor, knowledge, and materials. Farming is hard work, and that produces high densities of food plants and or animals. So that is essentially what people were doing 4,000 years ago in the area around Kampoosa Bog. They were putting effort into manipulating and changing their environment so that it was more productive to them. It's not the same as clearing and land and planting crops, but you could certainly see that as a step in that direction. So the Kampoosa Bog sites and the muck at the bottom of the bog, they have taught us about that hunter-gatherers do actively work on changing their environments to better provide for their needs. They've taught us about how people might transition from hunting and gathering to farming. And they've taught us something about how the ancestors of the Stockbridge-Munsee people lived and worked in the remote past, how they were stewards of their land. And so it's particularly appropriate that now they will be stewards of these tangible links to their past that make up this important archaeological collection. There we go.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eric. I really enjoyed that. It was really fascinating. I'm really glad we had the opportunity to hear about your work and gain a better understanding of Kampoosa Bog, because I think it's a significant site, but also a major piece of the community's past. And I think that's really important to have that understanding. So thank you. You know, prior to our conversations, you know, I guess going back to last year now about the repatriation of the collection, I didn't really know a lot about Kampoosa Bog and the work that was conducted at the sites. I think that's a really great example of how compliance obligations on both federal and state undertakings can help ultimately identify, record, and ideally preserve the tribe's cultural sites and resources. In this case with Kampoosa Bog, obviously it wasn't able to be avoided, but I think that it's important nonetheless to be able to understand that story. So I guess I want to, the last few minutes, I want to open it up for questions. We've had some questions come through and I have my own, but I want to start with the audiences so we make sure that we have time to answer those. And the first one we have asks, when you say that the artifacts will go to the tribe, will they be going in the museum in Boulder, Wisconsin? And I guess I can talk just for a second about that. And Eric, if you have anything to add to that, feel free. But yes, the repatriation conversation, you know, it's part of a process that we're going through, and you know, there's some legal implications and processes that we need to adhere to. But once I guess that talk is finished and we take it to our collection facility in Massachusetts, where the historic preservation offices are now located in Williamstown, Mass. We can then begin the conversation about what parts of the collection that can come back out to the museum out there in Wisconsin and be on display there. So it's just part of a dialogue that we're going to have and continue to have with UMass Amherst until we get the collection back, and then hopefully we can have a celebration to welcome some of that stuff home, and Heather will be able to finalize some exhibits and display them out there. Let's see here. So let's get to some other questions. I have one that asks, where did it go? Okay. Do you think that the settlement dated 2,000 years ago was used as a hunting camp, and the earlier site was a small settlement?
I'm not really sure. What I think the work area may have been associated with hunting. I've thought that looking at all these tools, right, and all the cache of tools, but people not living there, I've often wondered whether this might be associated with perhaps one of those large community hunts. Maybe they were driving deer into the bog, pulling them, killing them there, pulling them out. This is right next to the bog. And they're butchering, processing hides, and that's why we see all these tools, but we're not seeing them live there. The other site is just a little bit farther away, and that's more of a living area. So I think that as far as a hunting, not necessarily a hunting camp, but a hunting station, that might be what we're looking at the work area. And then the habitation is up a little bit away from the bog, away from this messy work area too. And that had already been, that was used for a longer period of time. I'm not, it's hard to be sure of the function of that habitation site other than people who are living there. But I believe that it's associated. And the thing that's separating the two, which might actually be really interesting to get a look at, is the Massachusetts Turnpike now. But I think the whole area around the bog has got to be very, has a lot of potential and really needs to be protected from destruction. The bog itself is protected, so that's good. It's gonna, the area around the bog will also be have some protection.
Absolutely. So I have another question here. You talked about the sites having stories to tell and being food for our imagination. Was it evocative to uncover these objects in the very places they were lost so long ago? And what does it feel like to touch them in the context?
That's a great question. It's hard to describe the feeling, but it's sort of, I don't know, mind expanding to find something, or even not to find it, but just to hold it in your hand and know that somebody made and used it thousands of years ago. And to me, and when I'm passing around artifacts to my students, sometimes they're looking on, yeah, and I say, no, think about that. Think about what you're holding. This piece is, whatever, 7,000 years old. Somebody made that then. And I'm like, oh. It's, it depends, I suppose, on what kind of imagination you have. But to me, it's inexpressibly moving, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that that's the one thing, obviously, with field and with folks that are drawn to the field and that appreciate cultural heritage. It's this tangible connection with the past, and there's a whole camp. Obviously, archaeology is science, and you take that role on. However, it's I think it's also important to think about the human connection, right, and the way that the agency that went behind the making of the production of these tools. And I think that's an important kind of thing to engage your imagination in that sense as well. So yeah. Okay, so going back to fire and forest management, Do fires initiated by lightning strikes enter into this research?
Well, you have to think about them because we know they happen. And as climate and environment change, a dry period might mean there are more forest fires. A cooler, wetter period, maybe not so much. So you have to think about, is that what we're seeing here? Or is it actually human agency that's causing the fires? And so that's why we looked for the correlation in time between, we know people were right there using the area, and that's when we see it most often being burned. And the suggestions that, not finding grass suggests that we're looking at understory fires. A lightning strike fire is more likely to end up as an uncontrolled catastrophic fire. And it's really interesting, after I talk about this site whenever I teach a course in archaeology. And after one time, one of the students said, so how did they do the burning? And I thought, that we don't really have that kind of fine-grained insight in archaeology. I would guess that to do the burning, you really have to know what you're doing. So it requires a lot of knowledge. And I would assume it also, like anything that's difficult and not sure of the outcome, requires ritual preparation as well. I then learned about a case in Australia where, long story short, there's a national park there that was really losing its biodiversity, and eventually the park managers connected with the local people, indigenous Australians there, and they said, yeah, well, we used to burn this area until the colonial government stopped us from doing it. So they said, okay, why don't you try your burning practices? And the traditional burning practices were incredibly complicated, and they took account of all the different seasons and which way the wind blew and the different microenvironments in here. And so to me, it sort of gave me a window maybe into what it might have been like here in the past with this understory burning. Understory burning is two words. It doesn't really describe the whole process. I just, again, something that thinking about it makes you contemplate all sorts of scenarios. Unfortunately, none of which can really be thoroughly corroborated by the archaeological evidence, but are always, it's a valuable thing to think about the past.
Perfect. Thank you, Eric. Right now we're having some sound difficulty. I don't know if that's coming through on Facebook or not, but I do want to just kind of wrap things up here because we're running kind of close on timing, but I just want to make two quick announcements. First, tomorrow we're going to be celebrating the Mohican New Year here on this page at 6 p.m. Central. So stop by if you have time to come and celebrate that. And if you enjoyed this installment of the Homelands History Series, please come back on February 10th, where we're going to be welcoming Dr. Kaylee Kosk of Oklahoma State University as she discusses how Mohican women in New Stockbridge influenced textile manufacturing. I want to thank you, Eric, for sharing your interpretation of Kampoosa Bog, and I also want to thank the audience for joining us this afternoon. I guess until next time, please stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time.